On the morning of December 6, 1917, a ship exploded in a Canadian harbor. It would remain the largest man-made explosion in human history for the next 28 years, until Hiroshima. Almost 2,000 people were killed in a matter of seconds. 9,000 more were injured. An entire neighborhood was wiped off the map. And here's the part almost nobody knows. The people who died had no idea what was sitting in their harbor that morning. In fact, for 20 minutes before the blast, hundreds of them were standing at their windows, watching it happen, because nobody had told them to run. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how two ships, one small mistake, and one closely guarded secret combined to produce one of the deadliest mornings in North American history. And you'll see how the lessons from that morning quietly shaped the way the world thinks about disaster, decades later, in ways you've probably never connected to this event. Let's start with the war. By December 1917, the First World War had been raging for 3 years. Halifax, Nova Scotia, was one of the busiest ports in North America. Convoys gathered there before making the dangerous crossing to Europe, ships loaded with soldiers, supplies, and weapons. The harbor was crowded, constant, tense. On the morning of December 6th, two ships were making their way through a narrow channel called the Narrows, the tight passage connecting the harbor to the open sea. One ship, the Immo, was a Norwegian relief vessel heading out. The other, the Mont Blanc, was a French cargo ship heading in. From the outside, the Mont Blanc looked completely unremarkable. Just another gray hull in a busy wartime port. But that appearance was deliberate, because inside that hull was one of the most dangerous cargoes ever loaded onto a single ship. Over 2,000 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, and 35 tons of highly flammable benzol fuel, stored in barrels lashed to the open deck, in plain view, in broad daylight. The Mont Blanc was, in effect, a floating bomb, and it was sailing directly into a crowded civilian harbor. Almost nobody in Halifax knew that. Because of wartime secrecy, the ship carried no warning flags, no markings, nothing to indicate what was inside. To everyone on shore, it was just cargo. Now here's where it gets strange. In that narrow channel, the two ships misread each other's signals. Both tried to correct. Both turned the wrong way. And at around 8:45 that morning, the bow of the Immo struck the side of the Mont Blanc. It wasn't even a hard hit, almost a glancing blow. The kind of collision that, on any other ship, would have meant a dented hull and an angry conversation between captains. But it was enough. Metal scraped against metal. Sparks hit the fumes rising off those exposed benzol barrels. And a fire broke out on deck. Small at first, the kind of fire you'd expect a crew to fight. But the crew of the Mont Blanc didn't fight it. They knew exactly what that fire was sitting on top of. They abandoned ship immediately, rowing for the far shore as fast as they could, shouting warnings that almost nobody on land could understand over the noise and confusion. And here's the detail that makes this story almost unbearable to think about. The burning ship didn't sink. It didn't drift out to open water. It drifted straight toward the Halifax shoreline and lodged itself against a pier, still burning, right in the middle of the city. And people came to watch. Office workers left their desks. School children pressed against classroom windows. Families gathered on porches and rooftops to see the spectacle. A ship on fire in the harbor was the most interesting thing to happen in Halifax in years. Nobody watching had any way of knowing they were looking directly at several thousand tons of high explosive, quietly heating up 20 minutes from detonating. For those 20 minutes, the fire burned. The crowd grew. And at 9:04 and 35 seconds that morning, the Mont Blanc exploded. What happened in the next few seconds is almost impossible to describe accurately, but I'm going to try, because the physics of it are genuinely staggering. The explosion released energy equal to roughly 3,000 tons of TNT. A column of smoke and debris shot more than a mile straight up into the sky. The ship itself was almost completely vaporized. One piece of it, an anchor shaft weighing half a ton, was later found over 3 kilometers away. A shockwave tore outward at thousands of meters per second, flattening buildings across a 2.5-kilometer radius. The Richmond district, a dense neighborhood of homes, schools, and factories, was almost entirely destroyed in an instant. Windows shattered 80 kilometers away. The sound of the blast was heard on Prince Edward Island, over 200 kilometers off. And then came a second wave most people never expect. The force of the explosion displaced the harbor water itself, sending a tsunami surging onto the shoreline, sweeping away survivors who had just been thrown clear of collapsing buildings. And remember all those people watching from their windows? That's where things get especially tragic. The shattering glass became one of the leading causes of injury that morning. Hundreds of people were blinded, some permanently, simply because they'd been standing at a window when the shockwave hit. In under 30 seconds, around 1,600 people were killed. Thousands more were injured. Roughly 12,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. And more than half the population of Halifax, around 25,000 people, were left without adequate shelter in the middle of a Canadian winter. In the middle of all that chaos, one moment stands out, and it's the kind of story that sticks with you. A railway dispatcher named Vincent Coleman was working near the harbor when he learned about the burning ship and its cargo, just minutes before the blast. He also knew something almost nobody else in that moment knew. An incoming passenger train, full of people, was due to arrive directly in the danger zone within minutes. He had time to run. Instead, he stayed at his post. Coleman sent a telegraph message down the line, warning oncoming trains to stay clear of Halifax. It was one of the last things he ever did. The blast killed him at his desk, but his warning worked. The train stopped short. Everyone aboard survived. You'd think the worst was over after the explosion. It wasn't. The very next day, a powerful blizzard hit Halifax, dumping heavy snow on a city that suddenly had no windows, no roofs, and thousands of injured, freezing survivors. Rescue crews that had been racing against time were now fighting through a snowstorm as well. Hospitals that hadn't been destroyed outright were completely overwhelmed. And for many survivors already weakened by the blast, that storm made the difference between life and death. But something remarkable happened next, something that still connects two cities to this day. Word of the disaster spread down the coast by telegraph. Boston, Massachusetts, over 700 kilometers away, was among the very first to respond. Within hours, Boston had mobilized doctors, nurses, and supplies, and sent a relief train racing north, straight into the same blizzard that was crippling Halifax. It became one of the fastest large-scale disaster relief operations in history at the time, and the bond formed that week never really faded. Even today, more than a century later, Nova Scotia sends the city of Boston a massive Christmas tree every single year, a quiet thank you passed down for generations. So how did something like this happen in the first place? An inquiry followed the disaster, and investigators assigned blame to the crews of both ships. But underneath the legal findings was a much bigger, uglier question. How had a floating stockpile of high explosives been allowed to sail into a crowded civilian harbor with no visible warning at all? The uncomfortable answer is that wartime secrecy, the very system meant to protect that cargo from enemy attack, had left an entire city blind to the danger sitting in its own front yard. And this is where the story reaches further than most people expect. The Halifax explosion permanently changed how dangerous cargo is handled at sea, leading to new regulations on labeling, loading, and routing explosive materials through populated ports, rules that are still in place today. But here's the part that connects this 1917 disaster to something much larger. The physical patterns of the blast, the radius of total destruction, the way buildings flattened near ground zero, the way the shockwave behaved as it moved outward, were later studied closely by scientists. Scientists researching the effects of a very different kind of weapon. For almost 3 decades, Halifax held a grim, unwanted record, the largest human-made explosion the world had ever witnessed. It held that record until August 1945, when a single weapon over Hiroshima redefined, permanently, what humans were capable of unleashing in an instant. Today, Halifax has been completely rebuilt. The Richmond district that was leveled that morning stands again, homes, schools, and streets restored across land that once looked like a war zone. A memorial bell tower rings out over the city every December 6th, and a single tree, lit each winter near the harbor, honors the memory of Vincent Coleman and the thousands of people who never made it home that day. Most visitors to Halifax today walk right past that harbor without any idea what happened there. The water looks calm. The docks look ordinary. But underneath that ordinary surface is one of the most devastating mornings in North American history. A hidden cargo, a 20-minute fire that drew a crowd instead of a warning, and a single moment that changed a city and the science of disaster response forever. And the next time you hear about a hazardous cargo ship or a dockside fire on the news, remember Halifax. Because the systems that make those situations safer today exist largely because, once,